Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before we begin today's webinar, we would like to review a few WebEx housekeeping items. First, simultaneous language interpretation is available for this event. You can select your preferred language by clicking the interpretation globe icon on the lower left-hand side of your screen. If you need English to French language interpretation, please select the French channel. If you need French to English language interpretation, please select the English channel. Use the slider in the interpretation menu to adjust the balance of the interpreter and the original audio. To hear only the interpreter, move the slider in the interpretation menu all the way to the right. Please note that you can switch your interpretation channel at any time. There are two recommended ways to connect to audio today: computer audio and through the Call Me feature in WebEx. You can switch your audio connection option at any time by clicking the down arrow next to your mute button and then click Switch Audio. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, we encourage you to submit all questions and comments into the chat panel. Please be sure to select everyone in the To field when submitting a question to ensure all panelists are able to see it. Finally, please note that we are recording this webinar and the recording and webinar materials will be available after the event. That concludes today's housekeeping. I will now pass it to Shipra to introduce today's content.
Thank you, Kayla. Welcome, everyone. My name is Shipra Srihari. I'm a resource tracking advisor at Apt Associates on the LHSS project, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I am so excited to be here to share with you the work that we've been doing on tracking pharmaceutical expenditure over the last couple of years. This activity has been jointly implemented by two USAID-funded projects, the Local Health System Sustainability Project and the Medicines, Technologies, and Pharmaceuticals program. We have also been collaborating with the Health Accounts team and some essential medicines experts at the World Health Organization on this activity. And we're all very excited to have this opportunity to share our achievements with you today. In case you're not familiar with the two USAID-funded projects, let me tell you a little bit about them. Next slide, please. The Local Health System Sustainability Project is USAID's flagship initiative in integrated health system strengthening. The goal of this project is to support low and middle income countries in achieving strong and sustainable health systems to support access to universal health coverage. We also have a focus on localization, and our overall aims are to increase financial protection, population coverage, and coverage of quality essential services. Next slide, please. The Medicines, Technologies, and Pharmaceuticals program, or MTaPS, works with low and middle income countries to strengthen their pharmaceutical systems to promote sustainable access to and appropriate use of safe, effective, quality assured, and affordable essential medicines and medicine-related pharmaceutical services. At the bottom of this slide, you can see the 7 technical areas through which MTaPS strengthens pharmaceutical systems, ranging from governance and regulatory systems to pharmaceutical financing and supply chain management. We are fortunate to have with us today, next slide please, Lisa Ludeman from USAID. She is a senior pharmaceutical management advisor and is here to share some opening remarks with us. So welcome, Lisa, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Shipra. And very nice to be here with everyone today for this exciting event. I am Lisa Ludeman, a Senior Technical Advisor in USAID's Office of Health Systems, and I'm a member of our Resource Optimization team in OHS, and I also focus on pharmaceutical management issues within the health system. As we'll hear about more in this session, high-performing health systems require countries to make the best use of limited resources. And of course, this includes medical products. We know that governments and individuals spend a significant portion of their health budgets on medicines and other medical products, upwards of 60% in many USAID-supported countries, and much of this is out-of-pocket spending. We also know that waste and inefficiency can represent more than 40% of health systems costs, and not surprisingly, medical products represent some of the most significant sources of inefficiency and waste in the health system. And without their effective management, UHC simply can't be achieved, let alone sustained. And as yet, many governments do not have a good handle on their actual expenditures on medical products. And by that, we mean medicines, vaccines, and medical devices. And this creates blind spots that leave countries vulnerable to budget overruns and ineffective spending. High quality information on pharmaceutical expenditures traces the flow of financial resources for medical products from source to end use. These data promote effective management, appropriate use, and relevant responsible policymaking. Ultimately, these factors contribute to optimized mobilization and use of health systems resources. We're excited to hear today from our MTaPS and LHSS experts about their experience developing a method for countries to better track their pharmaceutical spending and the application of this method in a few countries. We greatly appreciate the collaboration of many country and global stakeholders over the course of our work on this activity. It's an important global good, and we're really thrilled to see where it leads. So back over to you, Shipra. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa, for providing some important context to the work that we've been doing the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk you quickly through the agenda. We're going to start with a quick audience poll with a couple questions to get to know all of you. And then we will have a presentation to set the stage and understand the importance of pharmaceutical spending data. And we'll give you a high-level overview of the methodology that we've developed together. And then we will hear from two countries that have actually applied the methodology. Those countries are Vietnam and Burkina Faso. And then we will have an opportunity for Q&A. So please do keep entering your questions in the chat as you listen to our speakers. And then we'll have a few minutes to discuss next steps and recommendations for countries interested in tracking pharmaceutical spending in their health accounts. Next slide, please. So let's start with a quick poll. You should see a window pop up to the right side of your browser now. And we are asking two questions of everyone in the audience. We'd love to hear where you're dialing in from. And then we'd also like to hear from you what you feel is the main challenge that countries face in tracking pharmaceutical spending as part of health accounts estimations. So for the second question, if your response could be 2 to 3 words, that would be helpful so that we can see them coming in and see what people are thinking about challenges to tracking pharmaceutical spending. So I'm just going to pause for a few seconds and give people an opportunity to respond. Hopefully everyone is seeing the window that has popped up. Again, if you're just joining, we're answering a couple poll questions. So please let us know where you're dialing in from, and also in 2 to 3 words, what you feel is a main challenge that countries face in tracking pharmaceutical spending in detail in their health accounts estimations. Maybe a few more seconds for everyone to think about that second question, and then we'll show the results. So please do enter your responses. And Kayla, maybe in a few seconds, you can share the results on the screen, please. Great. So this is a response to the first sorry, just had a little bit of a technical glitch there. So this is the response to the first question. We see a number of our participants, not surprisingly, dialing in from the US and UK. Welcome to everyone. And it's exciting to see the other countries. We have folks joining from Myanmar, Bulgaria, Germany, all different time zones. I see Romania and Haiti on there. So welcome to everyone and thank you so much for joining. And let's see the next question responses. So this question was, what is the main challenge that countries face in tracking pharmaceutical spending? And I see, some really interesting responses. Lack of sufficient primary data, political constraints to sharing spending data. That's a great one. Lack of detailed information. No routine data collection. That's another one that we've seen. Disparate data. Good quality household data on medicine expenditure. So I think that's, the lack of good quality household data, incomplete data. So this is really exciting to see all of these responses that all of you have been thinking about what the challenges are to tracking pharmaceutical spending. I think those of us who work in resource tracking have seen many of these challenges in countries that are interested in tracking pharmaceutical spending. So we're excited that we're here to share with you our learnings on an approach that we've developed that hopefully will address some of these challenges. So thank you, Kayla, for sharing that slide. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to start now with a presentation from my colleague, Kwesi Egan, who's going to talk to us about the importance of pharmaceutical expenditure data and also give us a high-level overview of the methodology that we have developed on improving the accuracy of pharmaceutical spending data and health accounts estimations. Kwesi, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Shipra, and thanks all of you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kwesi Egan. I am a Principal Technical Advisor working for MSH on the USAID-funded MTaPS project. Over the years, tracking health expenditures, particularly focusing on pharmaceuticals, has been a pet passion of mine, and I really look forward to working with you all and interacting with you on this topic. And in the next few slides, I'll be sharing with you the overview of what we've done. Next slide, please. So we had a very unique collaborative exercise, MTaPS and LHS, with the key objective to increase the availability of quality data for pharmaceutical expenditure tracking and also increase the capacity of stakeholders to use this data for decision making. Accessing accurate pharmaceutical expenditure data and knowing how to use this, are very necessary to inform, governments and the overall health system, on decision makings on issues such as resource allocation and strategic purchasing. So our core interventions were to develop and test a resource to improve pharmaceutical expenditure tracking using the health accounts estimation methodology. We piloted it in Benin, in Burkina Faso, and Vietnam. We also, sought to build the capacity, of countries for the production and use of this PE data to improve decision making. Next slide, please. But why is this important? And that's a great question. Everybody wonder, why do we have to focus on pharmaceuticals? There are a couple of reasons, and one primary one is that spending on pharmaceuticals is high within many, health jurisdictions. Our expenditure on pharmaceuticals constitutes a large portion of healthcare expenditure. In lower middle income countries, this can go up to 50%, between 20 and 50% of the total health expenditure tends to be on pharmaceuticals. In lower middle income countries, that tends to be the second expenditure item following government, human resource payments. And it's important, this fact is important because in lower middle income countries, this expenditure A large component of it is what is represented in out-of-pocket payments. So if we want to increase access, we want to reduce catastrophic spending on individuals, understanding the expenditure on pharmaceuticals, both at the individual level, at the national level, is important. Over the years, countries also do not accurately estimate, and if they do not really report it consistently. So we think it's important that data, on pharmaceutical expenditure is made readily available, and knowing how to analyze and utilize them are also key to provide the kind of evidence that is needed for decision making around resource allocation, resource mobilization to enhance and assure equity and efficiency, particularly as we evolve and countries work towards universal health coverage. These become critical decision-making points. Knowing the total expenditure on pharmaceuticals, knowing the per capita expenditure will help in determining how much of resources will be allocated for pharmaceuticals, even in universal health coverage programs, and also in the design of pharmaceutical benefit management packages. Again, countries basically, based on our assessment, tend to lack the capacity to collect. And even though even in some countries where they can collect them, analyzing them, the approach to doing that tends to be difficult. So we do believe that it's a very important matter that needs to be done. And this exercise we've done in the last 2 years has started working towards that and making that area more visible. Next slide, please. So what is our overall theory of change? We believe that if we are able to provide resources, that includes standardized approaches to gathering data and also teaching people on how to analyze them. And if we are able to work with institutions within health systems to institutionalize and make data readily available in a very consistent manner, we will be able to, as it were, make the decision, provide evidence-based pharmaceutical data to enhance decision-making for allocation and for resource mobilization towards, increased financial risk protection around pharmaceutical spending within health systems. Slide, please. So, following this presentation, we'll be sharing with you the standardized approach that we've developed, but I'll give us, and all of us, general overview of how the guidelines in the guidance work. There are basically several steps, of which 5 of them we find very critical. One is the planning and preparation stage. One of the key lessons learned in our work is that forming the appropriate team that includes, people with pharmaceutical knowledge, preferably a pharmacist, is one of the key, success factors to having a successful, accurate estimation of pharmaceutical expenditures. A key step within the preparation is to identify what the policy questions are. What are the primary policy issues that the health system that you're dealing with deals with as far as pharmaceutical financing is concerned? What does the PE data that you are picking, address? Will it answer the questions that the core, decision makers are interested in? And of course, given the political, and the sensitivity, issues around pharmaceutical data, do you have the resources and the people to be able to help you basically pick the kind of data that you need? Having addressed that, the next step will be to identify the sources of data. We recommended 2 approaches. First, having a mapping of the financing flows within the country relative to pharmaceuticals. And then second, understanding what the supply chain elements are, or the various steps of pharmaceutical consumption are, from the imports or from the local manufacturers through intermediaries to users. Mapping out that is a critical step to be able to identify where data sources sit within the various countries. In the next slides, my colleagues will share with you how that was dealt with in Benin, Burkina Faso, and Vietnam. The next step really is how to compile and organize the PE data. With Benin, for instance, we had millions of records. Being able to understand how the compilation works, mapping them to the SHA 2011 data is key. And then finally, analyzing and presenting the data to meet the policy questions that the decision makers want to address is also key. So this in brief is the summary and a broad overview of what we did. In the next few slides, my colleagues will give you some more details. I'll hand over, the presentation to Shipra. Over to you, Shipra.
Thank you, Kwesi, for explaining to us the importance of this data to countries in their journeys towards UHC. So Kwesi has now given us a quick overview of the methodology also that we've developed to improve the accuracy of pharmaceutical expenditure estimates. And rather than go in more detail about the methodology, we thought we'd share with you some experiences from 2 countries that have applied this methodology in their health accounts estimations. Next slide. We're going to now turn over to my colleague from Vietnam, Mr. Hank Q. Hu, who is going to talk to us about some of the data sources and data that came out of this methodology in Vietnam. Hank, welcome, and over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Hank. I'm a member of the Vietnam Health Account team, and I also provide technical support for Vietnam Ministry of Health to conduct the pharmaceutical expenditure tracking pilot. So today I'm very happy to be here to share with all of you some experience from Vietnam for pharmaceutical expenditure tracking pilot. Next slide, please. Vietnam Ministry of Health is very interested in the PA tracking, and for National Health Account for 2018 and 19, it's the first time PA tracking is part of the National Health Account estimation. And because it's the first time, so we collect, could not collect all the data for PE. The main data source for PE include, first one is from Vietnam Social Security for social health insurance expenditure. The data from VSS is disaggregated by various factors such as 27 medicine group and by 63 provinces and by healthcare provider, including the central hospital, provincial hospital, district health station, private health facility, and commune health station, and by subnet by healthcare function, including the PE for inpatient and PE for outpatient, and PE by age group, including the under 5 years, from 5 to 15 years, and from 15 to 49, and from 49 to 60, and older than 60. But in the first time, so we could not obtain the PE by ICD-10 group and PE by medicine due to the time burden. Even that data is available in the database of VSS. And the second data source is come from the Ministry of Health for National Target Program expenditure. But we only collect the data from the HIV program is for ARV expenditure. We could not collect the data from other national target program, for example, like the TB, malaria, and vaccine program. And the third sort of the data is come from Vietnam Household Living Standards survey for that's conduct every 2 years in Vietnam. And the survey provide us the OOP expenditure for PE, but only the aggregate finger. And because the first time we collect the PE data, so some the missing data, including the PE from non-profit organization, from corporation, and from voluntary health insurance. Next slide, please. And here are some of the key findings when we conduct the PE tracking pilot. So the most important data sources come from Vietnam Social Health Insurance Pharmaceutical Expenditure. In Vietnam, it's more than 90% of population with the health insurance, but only more than 30% of the health expenditure is through the Vietnam Social Health Insurance. And the data from VHS is disaggregated by the 27 medicine group. But in the finger, we only want to show with all of you about top 5 and bottom 2 medicine group in terms of expenditure in 2019. And you can see the top is anti-parasitic and antibacterial drug. It's about more than 8,000 billion Vietnam dong, equivalent with 350 million US dollar and account for 25% of social health insurance pharmaceutical spending. And next one is the anti-neoplastic and immunosuppressive drug that is about nearly 5,000 billion Vietnam dong, equivalent about the 200 million US dollar and account for about 50%. And next one is a cardiovascular drug that account for around 12%. And the fourth is a mineral and vitamin, about 2,200 billion US dollar, equivalent about 100 million US dollar. And the fifth is a gastrointestinal drug. It's about more than 2,100 billion Vietnam dong. And the bottom 2 is a drug for treatment of urologic disease and the diabetic. That's very small, less than 0.1% of social health insurance pharmaceutical spending. So that is one of the key findings from the PE tracking pilot in Vietnam. Next slide, please. And the second key finding from the pilot is the social health insurance per capita pharmaceutical spending by province. In Vietnam, that's including 63 province. So we have the PE per capita by 63 province. So you can see here the average of the PE per capita about 322,000 dong, equivalent 13.6 US dollar. And there are some province, maybe 5 province, have the PE per capita is much higher than average and other province, because the 5 province with a lot of central hospital in the province. The central hospital is not only provides the healthcare services for the people in the province, but also provide healthcare services for the people come from other province. So that's the reason why there are some the province have the PE per capita much higher than average and other provinces. So that's all information I want to share with all of you today. Thank you for your listening. Back to Sibra.
Thank you, Hank. I'd now like to welcome Ms. Na from the Health Accounts team at the Ministry of Health. Ms. Phuti Na has joined us, and she will be talking to us a little bit more about the context of pharmaceutical expenditure tracking in Vietnam, the challenges, the utility of the data. So welcome, Ms. Na. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to start by asking you the first question about how you think pharmaceutical spending data can be useful to policymakers in Vietnam. Next slide, please. Over to you, Ms. Na.
Yes, thanks, Sibras. Hi, everybody. I'm Nga from Ministry of Health Vietnam. And I answer the question, how can PE data be useful in Vietnam? Firstly, PE data is used to monitor indicator in the Vietnam Pharmaceutical Strategic Plan to 2030. Secondly, PE data is used to assess change in the share of pharmaceutical in the total health expenditure. It should help National Health Account Team understand more detail of PE in the total health expenditure. It is important for decision making. Finally, it is used to examine efficiencies by evaluating spending by machine group.
Thank you, Ms. Na. I think it's interesting to see how PE data can be useful in a specific country. I think it'll be different for every country based on the policy priorities, the priorities as outlined in different pharmaceutical strategic plans, etc. So interesting to hear Vietnam's perspective. Now, if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the key challenges you faced in trying pharmaceutical expenditure tracking for the first time in Vietnam.
Yes, I think some of the key challenges PE attempted the first time in Vietnam. The development of PE for the first time is a new step in perfecting the information system in the National Health Account. However, the PE report has not really achieved good results due to lack of some related information, and the data collect method has not yet been completed. Difficult to obtain PE data. Example, Ministry of Health and VSS, Vietnam Social Security, unfamiliar with the data needs. You know the PE is a new job, so there's no job description to VSS, MOS, and relevant bodies. So the staff must work overtime to coordinate with the expert to establish a set of input data suitable to the requirements of PE. Additional burden on VSS to extract PE data. To develop the PE in Vietnam, we need to guide and train the staff in charge on detailed inputs to be collected and how to collect data. If the data is not available, how to deal with those data. Difficulty in defining policy a question at the start, because the policy maker on pharmaceutical cannot understand well about data collection methods, and the content of existing financial reports was not suitable to the requirement of PE. Also, I want to talk about PE future plans in Vietnam. Next slide, please. Yes, the PE report is made for the first time, so it can sensitize policymakers and agencies that own the data on the importance of checking PE. But we must continue building the PE in the future because this is the scientific basis for the policy. To make the PE checking in Vietnam, we need international donors help the Vietnam to train data collectors and health account team on the method to collect and classify the data. And then discuss potential approaches for more detailed OOP pharmaceutical expenditure estimate. Experts discuss existing database for private sector pharmaceutical sales. Discuss options for collecting detailed data on pharmaceutical expenditure from the Vietnam Social Security. And I think the immediate next step, we will organize a policy workshop to present data to pharmaceutical policymakers.
Thank you, Ms. Na, for sharing with us the experience from Vietnam. I think an interesting point that came out of the work with Vietnam is related to the last bullet on your slide here, in that when we started this exercise in Vietnam, traditionally in a health accounts, we start by understanding policy priorities to ensure that the data that we collect informs important policy questions in the country. And in Vietnam, it was a bit difficult to do this because no one had ever seen pharmaceutical spending data. They weren't sure what it would look like. So we are now actually planning to have this policy workshop now that we have the data from Vietnam, to share it with policymakers and have a discussion about what's interesting in the data and how it can inform policy questions and whether different types of data are needed. So thank you again, Ms. Na and Hank, for sharing your experiences on Vietnam. Next slide, please. Now we are going to shift to hearing about our country experience from Burkina Faso. Just a quick reminder to please select, using the globe in the bottom of your screen, your preferred language, because our presenter will be presenting in French. So you should choose English if you'd like to hear the interpretation in English, and choose French if you wish to hear in French. So next slide, please. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Simon Nassa from the Ministry of Health in Burkina Faso, who's going to share with us some of the experience in Burkina. Welcome, Nassa, over to you.
Hello, I am Nassa Simon. I'm the focal point of the Health Accounts Unit in Burkina Faso. It's an honor for me to present the experience of Burkina Faso and our study on pharmaceutical expenditure. So I will start by the importance of this study, the study on pharmaceutical expenditure in Burkina Faso. We did this in 2018. This exercise enabled us to answer a certain number of priority policy questions. For example, about the mobilization of resources. This allows us to know whether our investment in pharmaceutical products are adequate. So ask the question as to whether increasing this expenditure is coherent with the demands of the population, and whether this should be done annually or how frequently these studies should be carried out. So in terms of resource allocation, we can ask ourselves the question as to whether our pharmaceutical expenditure reflects the health policy priorities, or is it not households that spend the most on this? So if there's a part of the population that lacks health coverage, as in Burkina Faso. And finally, we can talk about the effectiveness of the spending to see what are the main factors in the growth of pharmaceutical expenditure. So these are various questions that could this study could help us answer. Next slide, please. In order to collect this data, we used three sources. For the public sector, we collected it in the Center for Purchasing Generic Medicines, which buys public medicines. In the private sector, we collected data from the National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency. This agency was able to tell us about the products that were imported in the private sector in the country. And we also collected data from various health programs across the country, which directly provide products to these programs. So altogether, we collected more than 100,000 rows of data. But please note that we then triangulated to avoid duplication. Next slide, please.
Voilà, donc,
so here's a summary of the results we came up with. We can see that in terms of expenditure, it is the anti-malarial drugs and HIV/AIDS drugs and vaccines, which represents the most expenditure. Then you have a second group of medicines, which are non-contagious diseases. We have disease of the digestive system. We have products that fight nutritional deficiencies, lymphatic filariasis, hypertensive diseases, and respiratory infections. So that is a second group of medicines that uses up a lot of resources within the system. But this system needs to strengthen its ability to distribute certain medicines that we are unable to distribute. Next slide, please. In terms of sources of data, we can see that it's households that consume the most resources, with over 62% of dependencies of spending. Then come our partners with 35.1%. So the government spends very little on pharmaceutical products. So here we can see on the right, we can see our partners, the Global Fund, the World Bank, USAID, Gavi, and the World Health Organization, UNICEF, who represent 35% of health expenditure in Burkina Faso. So the products can be grouped by disease. So here we have malaria. We have a list of all the products used for malaria and all of the amounts. This shows that our study is really quite exhaustive. We weren't able to show you all the results here, but we have results according to the different regions and also by inhabitant per capita. So in terms of the lessons learnt, we can say that these products here, knowing the expenditure, will enable us to prioritize our action at government level. All the stakeholders must also be informed, notably in terms of supply, and we then need to triangulate. And if everyone is involved, we have a lot of data collected, but it will take less time. So in brief, this is what we can say about the lessons learned from Burkina Faso.
Thank you, NASA, for sharing Burkina's experiences. Also very exciting to see the data that's coming out of your exercise. I have a few questions for you as well. I think you've already answered the first question around how this data can be useful to decision makers in your first slide, where you shared with us some of the key policy questions in Burkina Faso. So I'm going to move to the next question. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the key challenges that you faced in this exercise.
Oui, merci bien. Alors,
yes, thank you. So the first challenge was data collection. Initially, all the stakeholders had problems. The pharmacists, the centralized supply system agency, all of those organizations were not told in advance, were not informed in advance. So it was a challenge for them. We had to go to a very high level to the top management levels in the ministry in order to be able to get this moving. That was the main challenge for us. If everyone's involved from the beginning, especially pharmacists, I think it really helps, it really facilitates data collection. It's true that for treating the data, over time we can find a method that will facilitate collection.
Thank you, NASA. I think that is a common challenge that that Vietnam also faced in terms of accessing data that can sometimes be difficult to access and also potentially sensitive. So interesting to hear similar experiences in both countries. Could you also tell us a little bit about what the plans are for the future for tracking pharmaceutical spending in Burkina?
Oui, les projets pour la...
The projects for the future tracking, I think as the exercise carries on, we can integrate this study into the health system. We have regulated accounts since 2003, so we can integrate these data into it. So pharmaceutical expenditure are not disaggregated enough. So we want to be able to further disaggregate our pharmaceutical expenditure data in order to better inform the decision makers in their strategic decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, NASA, and thanks again for sharing the experience from Burkina. Next slide, please. It's now time for our Q&A session, so I hope all of you have been entering your questions into the chat as we've been hearing our presentations. The faces on this slide are familiar to you by now. You've heard from all of them, except for my colleague Andre Zita, who's been a key technical member in this work on the MTaPS program. And so I'd like to direct the first question today to Andre. Andre, could you tell us a little bit about your experience with compiling and organizing and mapping the pharmaceutical expenditure data in Burkina Faso? Welcome, Andre, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Shipra. So my experience in compiling and analyzing the pharmaceutical expenditure data in Burkina and also Benin is, as a first step for this type of exercise, there was a lot of challenges in starting and where to go to, how to compile the data, what type of variable to maintain. It's a lot of variable when you collect the data, and sometimes you can, get lost in the volume of the information, and also the double counting process that we are all trying to avoid while collecting and compiling this data. So first we started with making sure that we track all data sources first to understand the flow from where it's coming from and where it's going, who is giving moving drug from where to where, so that we'll make sure that we don't double count the information. Now, compiling the data, the first idea was to use the health account production tool, but then using the health account production tool, the challenge would have been to see all the variable in the flat file to be able to do the analysis. So we decided to start as a first experience to use the whole data mapping methodology before the health account production tool, mapping the data using Excel. That was the first experience, and the data mapping also was, I would say, a bit challenging because of the disease components, not understanding how to link each drug to the disease category. So we decided to use the ATC classification, and that was a good experience, but still challenging. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. I think it's useful for other countries who are thinking about this to hear the experience with the large volume of data and how you handled it, which we know was challenging, but in the end ended up with some very interesting results. So thank you for sharing your experience in Burkina Faso. I'd now like to pose a question to Mr. Nasa from Burkina Faso. One of our audience members is asking, would you recommend the yearly production of pharmaceutical expenditure as part of health accounts estimations, that countries do this each time they do a health accounts? And if yes, for what reason do you think this should be done on a regular basis? Over to you, Nasa. Nasa, I'm not sure if you heard the question, so let me pose it to another panelist and then you can chime in if you'd also like to answer. I'm curious to also ask this question of Mr. Henk in Vietnam. Henk, could you tell us what your thoughts are about doing pharmaceutical expenditure tracking on a yearly basis and whether you think this is useful and why?
Thank you for your question. I think beyond the available data right now from Vietnam, it's very difficult to conduct the yearly PE tracking. If we need the detailed data like the PE by medicine and PE by ICD-10 group, because it's takes a lot of time for the people. So I think, for example, like the national account in Vietnam by the ICD-10 group or by the burden of disease, the Ministry of Health and WHO in Vietnam agree that maybe only every 3 or 4 years we will conduct that one time. And I think that maybe similar with the PE tracking. So maybe we will conduct maybe every 2 or 3 years or 4 years, something like that. That's it.
Thank you, Henk. And I mean, also to add, I think that countries who start pharmaceutical expenditure tracking may want to start, as we did in Vietnam, small with one piece of the data. In Vietnam, that was the social health insurance data, and countries can always build upon this in future years. And also, Andre was talking about mapping drugs to therapeutic classes, which facilitates their mapping to disease condition in the SHA framework. And this is something that is time consuming, but once it's done in the first year, it will be much less time consuming in subsequent years as one can develop a crosswalk between therapeutic classes and disease. So thank you, Henk, for your response. I think we have time, unfortunately, just for one more very quick question. I'd like to direct that to Kwesi from MTaPS. Kwesi, can you just talk for a quick minute about the particular challenges in pharmaceutical expenditure tracking in terms of getting data from the pharmaceutical sector? We only have about 30 seconds. If you could give us a quick response to alert our audience. Thank you.
Yeah. So with the examples that we experienced in Burkina and Vietnam, having the right team is key. Being able to map out where the data sits. For instance, working with the Food and Drug Authority and their willingness to be able to show you what has come in, through the regulatory arm, then being able to have access to national procurement data, and also being able to validate that at the health facility level in terms of what consumption was. Were very key challenges that one has to look at and address as you move forward.
Thanks, Kwesi, for that quick answer. I mean, I think it is relatively new to countries to start to collect these large volumes of pharmaceutical data, so it's helpful to hear some of the challenges and tips that we have learned from our work in Burkina Faso and Vietnam. So now we're going to end the Q&A session. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everybody's questions. If you keep putting your questions in the chat, hopefully some of our panelists, I know Andre was planning on responding to some of them in the chat, so hopefully you can still get some responses in the last few minutes. And if not, please do reach out to us and we can always, we're happy to communicate and share information with you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to switch gears now and very quickly to wrap up the discussion, talk about some next steps for countries interested in pharmaceutical expenditure tracking. Next. So as Kwesi mentioned, our projects together have developed a resource that guides countries on how to incorporate detailed pharmaceutical spending data into their health accounts estimation. This resource is just being finalized this week, and we do plan to post it early next year on the LHSS and MTaPS websites. So please do look out for the resource. As I mentioned early on, we have been collaborating with the World Health Organization on this activity, and this particular resource that we develop will be used by the WHO to inform their global guidance on pharmaceutical expenditure tracking that they're working on and plan to release sometime next year. So please do look out for the resource. Next slide. Thank you, Kayla. So in terms of some tips for countries interested in tracking pharmaceutical spending, hopefully you've learned and gotten some ideas from the countries that have presented today. I think it's clear from what we've heard that you do need some pharmaceutical expertise to support the health accounts team, for example, for identifying data sources, for mapping and collecting the data. It's also important to consider the time and resources required to include pharmaceutical spending. For example, in Burkina Faso, you could see there was a very large volume of data that was collected, and it was quite time consuming to collect and organize and to map the data. And along the same lines, for countries to consider what level of detail is actually worth the time and effort. The most time consuming part of mapping pharmaceutical spending data is assigning it to disease condition amongst the SHA classifications. So some countries may want to consider whether that is needed in their question, whether it will answer key policy questions, or whether it might be sufficient to have information, for example, on source or scheme, or maybe just a better estimate of total pharmaceutical spending. As Kwesi mentioned near the end, and we've heard from our speakers as well, it's important to consider the barriers to accessing sensitive data and to plan ahead. Spending on pharmaceuticals is quite sensitive, so it's really important to consider the political economy of the various actors in the pharmaceutical system and to think about how to bring them on board so that you can actually access the data that you need to track pharmaceutical spending. And then the final point that I think we always emphasize in health accounts is to really consider from the beginning the key policy questions with pharmaceutical decision makers so that you can ensure that the data you're collecting actually answers those policy questions and is not just data being produced for the sake of data. Next slide, please. So on that note, this slide is just a reminder of some of the policy questions, some illustrative questions actually, that pharmaceutical spending data can help you answer. So these questions are organized according to policy areas, and you'll see here questions on financing, sustainable financing, on financial protection, and on efficiency. So definitely worth thinking about which of these policy questions pharmaceutical spending data can help answer in your country. So just some quick announcements. Next slide, please. Please do take the evaluation if you have a couple minutes after the webinar. Everyone will be receiving a recording of today's webinar. If you're interested in learning more about our projects, please visit the MTaPS and LHSS websites. And as I mentioned, please do look on those websites in the first quarter of next year to see the resource that we are producing. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. We're so excited that we had this opportunity to share our exciting work with all of you. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists who joined. I'd like to thank our USAID activity managers, Scott Stewart and Lisa Ludeman. I'd like to thank the World Health Organization Health Accounts team in Geneva and other regions, including European and Southeast Asia region, as well as our essential medicines colleagues at the WHO. I'd like to thank my colleague Heather Cogswell for developing this webinar, and also to Kayla Thompson for technical support. And thanks again to all of you for joining. I hope you found this to be interesting and useful, and hope everyone has a wonderful day or a wonderful evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.